is His Majesty's Fort at Crown Point, which is a much more impressive, even though you don't see a lot of stone around anymore, much more impressive fort. This makes Fort Ticonderoga look ever so small. It's just gigantic, and so you can see why after 1759 the British emphasis is here, not at Ticonderoga. So Amherst is constructing this big fort that takes a couple years to build. Guys down, he's probably not all that concerned that the guys at Ticonderoga aren't exactly following his orders to rebuild down there, because this is where it's all going to happen for now on. The construction here, just think of all those provincial soldiers. They've enlisted to fight the French. They arrive here and they spend all summer building, cutting timber. They're not happy. My wife has an ancestor who dies here in 1759, and other than his name and the date he dies here, we haven't been able to find out much yet. We're still trying to dig and find out, but his name's William Blood. Somebody's talking about Bloodstown Forest. Tim, right? But his name was Blood, and he dies here in November 1759, and that's unfortunately all we can figure out right now. He's obviously already had children if he has descendants. So he's not one of these young 1890s. He's probably mid to late 20s when he's here for a campaign. He would have enlisted at the beginning of 59 when Ticonderoga and Crown Point are both still in French hands. So he was probably involved in that campaign, and then he's still here in November. Usually November 1st is about the time they send people, the provincials, home. As I recall, he dies in the middle of November.
Perhaps he was sick.
But perhaps he was sick and wasn't ready to go home. But just imagine, this is wilderness still, and constructing something this big, with this big of a vision. Standing right here, you can see that's looking north down the lake. And it really commands that approach really well. The Maritime Museum is about 13 miles up the hill from where we are now. I mean, up the lake from where we are now. And this is the launching point. How many of you have seen, speaking of old movies, the Northwest Passage with Spencer Tracy playing Robert Rogers, going to attack St. Francis? Well, this is where that attack is launched from in the fall of 1759. And this is where Rogers had hoped to get back to, which he didn't. He ended up on the east side of Vermont on the way back down. But this becomes the point, and when we get inside, it all falls apart because of that laundry fire. And have any of you ever used any transcripts from a court-martial with your students? Courts-martial, that's plural, not court-martials, courts-martial can be really confusing. It's military rather than civilian, but the transcript for the court-martial, for who's responsible for the loss of Crown Point, exists. And it reads like a comedy of errors. Everybody is blaming everybody else, and finally it's the poor washerwoman who gets the final blame.
No way.
Well, it's her fire that gets out of control, regardless of so-and-so doesn't do this and so-and-so doesn't do that. So, and she's not officially in the Army, so. But for all of this to get lost. So the powder magazine, I believe, was up on this end. So as that fire goes through, and they're stone buildings, but all these walls are timber lined, and you've got floors, you've got roofs, so everything inside burns, and you feel the breeze. It's always windy here. So much like Ticonderoga, it's almost always breezy, except on those days when the high is exactly over us. There's always a breeze either from the north or the south. So it doesn't take much for that fire to get whipped through, and when it reaches the powder magazine, they hear it and feel it at Ticonderoga. Feels like an earthquake.
Were all the people out by then?
As far as I know, no one was killed during the fire. So now you have this smoldering ruin, and at the beginning of the Revolution, there's a few people here when Arnold and Allen capture Ticonderoga and then capture the outpost. And at the beginning of 1776, there's a real impression that maybe this is where the Americans need to make their stand. And I think had it not been the smallpox issue, this might have been where they made the stand. And I work at Fort Ticonderoga, so of course Fort Ticonderoga is more important. But I think strategically Crown Point might have been the better choice in 1776. They wouldn't have to build a Mount Independence across the river. So you can understand why there's this concern in Congress and at Washington's headquarters when news arrives that they've abandoned Ticonderoga. Now, the decision to abandon Crown Point, when the decision is made, it's a unanimous decision by the officers here to abandon. So it's not a split decision. It's not Gates and Scott.
Because of disease that they decided to...
Well, I think they're also thinking they'd like to be a little closer to their supply line. And by falling back to Ticonderoga, you're right there at Lake George. Yeah, here, it's just that much further of a supply line, and it might be easier to cut off than if you fall back to Ticonderoga.
I mean, as far as protection from artillery and stuff, the earthworks would
have done well. And throughout the summer and into the fall of 1776, there are troops here at Crown Point as an advance guard.
Are they camped inside the...
They're probably more out where the lighthouse is, on the other side of the bridge. But their job, their orders are, they're an advance guard. They're to report on anything they see coming up the lake. And they're not to engage the enemy. If they're at a point where they feel they need to engage, they need to withdraw back. And for most of the summer, it's members of the 6th Pennsylvania Battalion, whose commander is Arthur St. Clair, but whose commander here is Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hartley. And so Hartley's name will pop up. If you get a chance to look for Hartley on the Peter Force, a lot of his correspondence will pop up back and forth to Gates from here. This does become a great place to stage the fleet, which Jim talked about. And you didn't tell the Wynkoop story because you... Oh, do you want to tell the story about what happens here when Arnold takes the fleet out?
Oh, well, about...
And Wynkoop orders him back?
He orders him back, yeah.
And Wynkoop orders the cannon to open fire?
Yeah, open fire on him.
Yeah,
That's right. There's a little disagreement. Wynkoop didn't quite believe that Arnold was officially supposed to be in command of the vessel.
After all, Schuyler hired him and nobody's told him otherwise.
Yeah, right, exactly. So, yeah, he ends up arresting Wynkoop.
And he's supposed to... Gates tells him to bring him in chains.
Yes, right.
And Arnold says, I can't do that to the old guy. And they just send him back and find a way to quietly put him away.
I was going to say, too, if you recall, there's a quote that I read from Sullivan when he's talking about how they're going to build ships to stage a defense on the lake. And what he says to Washington, and this is early in the spring of '76, he says, the officers believe we should fortify Crown Point. And that's, he says specifically it's Crown Point that they're going to fortify. And of course, as Rich said, after some debate, they decided to give it up. But there's a letter from Washington, I think, writing to Sullivan or Gates saying, well, I guess, if you think so, but...
It's very critical, but he says, but as I'm not there.
Exactly.
As I'm not on the ground.
But he didn't think that
I'll have to take your word for it.
These letters are in American archives.
They are in the American archives. And when the Americans withdraw from here to Ticonderoga, this area, the civilian population in this area at the time, is all on the Vermont shore. You can see how close the mountains are over here. The farming is much better on that shore. And the civilian population is all the way up to, it's not called Burlington at that point, but we're modern day Burlington. And by the American Army withdrawing from here, it makes them even more susceptible to a British harassment and invasions.
Were most of the people settled there, were they French Canadian?
No, at this point they're all from New England. Okay. There is after the French and Indian War and the French threat is taken care of, what is now Vermont, especially along the lake shore and up the Connecticut River, is settled very quickly. Almost all the towns from Ticonderoga up through to Burlington on the Vermont side, you'll say founded 1761, founded 1761, founded 1762, founded 1761. It's all right after the fall of Quebec in 1760, and boom, and there's a whole story about who controls, who's making money giving out the land in the Hampshire grants, and Benning Wentworth has a lot to do with that, and the whole Ethan Allen Green Mountain Boys arises over who controls the Hampshire grants. You know, those Green Mountain Boys are the Bennington mob on this side of the lake.
Maybe you've said this, but where did they quarry most of the stone
You know,
for these buildings?
for things like this, at Ticonderoga, there's a cliff on the south side towards the lake, and it was quarried right off the cliff face there. There was also a quarry about a quarter mile northwest of the fort where they quarried the stone. Here, and again, the limestone's right here, and to create the dry moat, they actually had to blast out the stone, so they had building material that they were blasting out. This is not a wet moat, it's a dry moat. But it was just, in order to create it, that you put over there, we'll probably find drill marks where they drill holes and put powder in to break it off. So they kind of had, they didn't have to go too far to get it. They may not have had enough to completely cover it, but there's no evidence that all the walls were here. The exterior walls were stone. Mostly would have been timber with earth behind them. Okay, there's a lot of fun things to explore on the inside. I'll be hanging out in the middle somewhere if anybody has questions. We may be on track to leave a little early. I don't know if anybody's going to be disappointed about that. So